Ahoy! Joe Buddy Hambone here, and I'm back again with a brand new coupon code from our friends over at Noble Knight Games. This month, the code is LEGENDS. It's good for 10% off orders of $10 or more now through November 19th. Noble Knight has all your RPG back-to-school needs. One-stop shop, and whether it's board games, magic cards, books, dice, whatever it may be, Noble Knight is the place to be. Using the code LEGENDS, good for 10% off orders of $10 or more, running now through November 19th, you can set yourself up pretty pre-holidays with everything you need to run some games for your friends and your family. So next time you're checking out at Noble Knight Games, don't forget to use the code LEGENDS. Good for 10% off orders of $10 or more, running now through November 19th. From our friends over at Noble Knight Games.
This is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the founder and publisher of Unwinnable. He recently told me he's never going to take another train ride, Stu Horvath.
That's not true. I love train rides.
I don't know how you'd feel about it after this last week, but before we get into that, Stu, I want to let the listeners know we have another Indie RPG elevator pitch brought to you by our friends over at Exalted Funeral. Later on in the show tonight, we're talking to Tony Plus One about Down We Go. But before we get to that, Stu, you just finished something big.
Yeah. You know, it's funny because I finished a book, writing a whole book, and that took less time than running Horror on the Orient Express, which I just got done with this past Thursday.
So for those listening at home and who may not have caught it early on in the pandemic, Stu finally got to run Horror on the Orient Express. Now, you started this back in what, May of last year?
It was something like May, early June, something like that.
And so now, over a full year later, your group has finally finished the game.
We have.
How does it feel?
You know, I was really jazzed, man. I was really, really jazzed I'm still kind of jazzed. It's like 4 or 5 days later now, and I'm still like, yeah, man, we did it. We got all the way through.
And it was not for lack of killing your players, though, right? Because it was a very harrowing experience for your players.
Yeah, you know, I was on the Miskatonic University podcast back in October, November last year. And I was sort of complaining because I was just like, I haven't killed any of them. I haven't gotten any of them insane. And they kind of workshopped it with me. And then after that, the death count really started to climb rapidly. We had 6 players, 7 deaths over the course of the campaign, 3 characters standing at the end. Only one of those characters was there from the beginning. So one poor bastard made it all the way from the start of the train to the end of the train.
And was he like Johnny Action Hero tank guy, or what was he?
No, he's like this weirdo doctor that David Shimomura played. And he's just like, he was obsessed with eggs. He was not a good doctor. He was more of a forensic surgeon. He was the one that it all came down to. Like, the least qualified person in the group is like the only one when the living God is standing in front of him. And everybody else is like trying to tear their eyes out. And it's just, it all came down to Dr. Mauve. What?
All right, don't get to the end just yet. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about some of the highlights of this? Because yes, you know, we generally talk about vintage RPGs and new RPGs. However, our RPG experience is really what brought us to doing this show. So, you know, we're taking a little detour this week for the first 3/4 of the episode to kind of give you a look behind the scenes of what makes us excited about playing RPGs. So, Stu, before we get into the deeper ins and outs of this, give everyone the broad strokes for those who may not know what Horror on the Orient Express is.
So, of course, like if you're thinking about playing this or you are playing this with a group, don't listen to the rest of the episode. Just skip to the end where we talk to Tony, okay? Because inevitably I'm going to probably spoil something accidentally. Basically, it's 1920s. You're summoned to England by a friend. You're tasked with going along the Orient Express, sparing no expense along the way stopping in the beautiful cities of continental Europe, looking for pieces of an ancient evil artifact that have been lost over the centuries, because you need to reassemble them and bring them to Constantinople and destroy them in the place that they were born, they were made, sort of like the Ring, and throwing it into the whole, Mount Doom. It's on rails, so it's fairly linear.
Literally.
But the 2014 re-release that Chaosium did is much expanded with historical flashbacks. So in the original version, you would get these handouts that would detail something that happened 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago. Now you get those, but they unlock optional scenarios with pre-generated characters that you can go back and play. That brings a whole new level of awesome to the game. And I think that it's sort of like, a lot of people don't like to play games where they feel like they're very linear. And Horror on the Orient Express is necessarily very linear. Even the stops along the way, you're very much involved in, like, you go to a place, you find the weird thing, you get the piece that you were looking for, then you get back on the train and you keep going. Those beats stay the same throughout the whole journey. So these flashbacks are totally different, and they really break it up nicely. And they were some of the most favorite things, I think, for everybody playing, because they detail sort of the secondary villain's history with this ancient artifact, to the point where he almost feels like the main villain, but he's not, because the main villain is sort of hiding in the shadows the entire time, manipulating events. You're doing his dirty work, really. The thing about a linear game is that it really lets you get some nice scripted moments. My group was into it, man. Like, there were a couple moments that I just, like, I nailed the delivery and, like, everything lined up, and, like, I got that dramatic punch. And, like, it's hard to do that when you're sort of like doing like a sandbox campaign. Like, there's no real opportunity to, like, aha, in Masks of Nyarlathotep, right? Like, there's awesome things that happen, and a lot of stuff is born out of your character's actions, but it's rare that you get a reveal about a character or the machinations of the narrative and get like that amped, like, oh my God, this was the Lost season finale, like when Lost was good. And
that's why you said season and not series, but go on.
yeah. And, like, you get amped and you're just like, oh my God, that was awesome. And, like, I can't wait to play again because I want to find out more about this story. Like, that's sort of the benefit of playing like a linear, kind of more curated narrative experience.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you are going to play a game on rails, having it actually be on rails on a train makes a lot of sense. And, to a degree, as someone who played in your Masks campaign, where, full disclosure, dear listener, my group did play Masks of Nyarlathotep like a bunch of murder hobos. So I imagine this experience had to be a little different for you, because you are actually playing with people who are fully invested, not coming to your table to play Dungeons and Dragons as Call of Cthulhu. So what was that like, playing with a different group of people who had, maybe a different headspace for getting into the game? Because in a situation like this, where you do have something that's on rails, where you do have it kind of being guided narratively and actually by the train, it might lend itself, in my brain, a little bit better to people who are really kind of diving into it for the first time and willing to fully invest themselves in it versus a sandbox.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely easier to handle. It's long, but it's very episodic. Every chapter is a city. Every chapter is a flashback. You could conceivably kind of like take breaks in between them. Our sessions were only 2 hours every week. So, like, we made really good time. It was, it was almost the optimal kind of, Roll20 digital Call of Cthulhu experience, just because, like, I was able to really, like, if I needed to get through something or I wanted to get through something, like, it was really easy to hit the gas and, like, push through it, because you know what the destination is, right?
Right.
And it was cool too, because it was a very different group. They're less harebrained schemes, which, as enjoyable as harebrained schemes are, they are always sort of like derailing by their nature. And it was cool because they're not murder hobos. They were just more inclined to be scared or to do, like, interesting things. So, like, when the secondary villain came, reveals himself and attacks, like, all the villains in the piece sort of have a vested interest in letting the players be their stalking horses. So the secondary villain is terrifying when he shows up, and he kills a whole bunch of people. The first person that he killed really was the heart and soul of the group. Levi, who is playing him, has like this great Boston accent. He's just like this lovable guy. and he got his head pulled off, basically. Like, he got pulled out the window, and then they heard the screams from the top of the train. Like, you guys would have just been like, well, we are going to get every gun and we are going to like get this guy. Half the party in this one, they just went to the salon car and started drinking. Like, they just kind of like, they were so shook that was, I mean, hey, I honestly, like, that's probably what I would do if, like, Hambone, you got pulled out the window by a monster. I'd be like, well, time to hit the bar car.
Well, listen, man, on behalf of my mask squad, mistakes were made. We went about things a little bit differently, but that's cool because that really does lend itself to those beautiful character moments, even though I can't believe you killed the Rudy of the group, like, first thing out the gate. But that's the thing about playing RPGs, is that you can expect the unexpected to happen. So you're playing this game with this group. You're loving doing it on Roll20. How did you find the experience of communicating the horror over the internet?
It's interesting. They're just generally not a horror group, I feel like, in their core. Like, Dave, some of them are, but like, there's also just people, they're just not horror people, which isn't to say that they don't like horror. Obviously, they spent, more than a year playing a horror role-playing game, but they're not as calloused when it comes to horror as like me. Like, where like I can watch horror movies hour after hour and just like not be affected at all. So it was kind of interesting to see, like, I would just read stuff out of the book and I would hear like people get uncomfortable. And granted, the campaign is high on the body horror. There's a lot of like stuff with skin and organs and transplants that kind of is a theme that gets hit over and over and over again, sometimes to really uncomfortable effect. Yeah, the gross stuff definitely, like, you could tell, because like none of us were distracted by us around the table. Everybody's just sort of like, I'd be narrating and I think that everybody would just sort of be like doing their thing. Like, they'd be forced to kind of picture it in their head.
Right.
Whereas like if you're around the table with us, you could just like go get some chips or something, or like have some side chatter. And yeah, I think that there were a couple moments where folks were genuinely, I think it's really hard to be scared during a role-playing game, just generally, unless like you have really serious buy-in. But I do think that over the course of this game, I definitely hit unsettled amongst the group pretty frequently.
And that's kind of hard to do. And I agree with that. In horror, in games, it's very hard to get that scare across. So I think the best you could hope for is present and unsettled, which I think you got both when you're doing it the way you did it over Roll20. So, man, good on you. What I want to know, though, is before we get into what your favorite moment was, if you don't mind sharing your favorite moment, because obviously I know you might not want to spoil it for some people, but years ago, I remember when you got the box. And when you opened the box for the first time, it was hard to put the things back into it because it was one of those boxes. And dear listener, you know this as people who buy and play games. Some of these things don't want to get back in the box.
It still doesn't. I packed everything back up. There's no way. So I have a whole bunch of like handouts and stuff. I just stuck them in like a folder to keep them in like a filing cabinet because I can't get them in there.
Well, let me ask you this, and this is really what I'm leading to. Knowing that you finally got to run it, do you now feel a little bit better about not being able to fit everything back in the damn box?
Yeah, but like at the same time, part of the cool thing about the box is the statue that you're trying to get. They have a really good like puzzle piece handout thing. So like as you get parts of this statue, which is a humanoid statue, they're really nice thick card stock that you could like place on the table and put together. And then you have like a little cardboard statue guy at the end. So like, yes, I do feel good about that. But like the downside to the playing online is that you don't have the tactile feels, which is always going to be a disappointment.
Well, all right, Stu, if you don't mind sharing, what was your favorite moment of running horror on the Orient Express?
It was like a narrative moment. Like they finished their mission. It was one of the flashback missions. It was the Dark Ages of the Crusades. And they did everything right. They got a pat on the head from their lord and liege, but somebody absconded with the thing that they were trying to get, which was this statue. And they were dealing with this monk, and that's the guy who stole it. And the Lord is just like, you go find him, you hunt him down, you get that thing. This was a cruel betrayal. And just remember, in the East, they call him Fenelic. And they had heard that name in relationship through the whole campaign as the previous owner of this statue. So they realized that they had just put this thing into the hands of like this guy, and they had just played through this crucial moment where they set this guy on this path that wreaks so much havoc across Europe for centuries. And like, it was just that moment because they hadn't realized that the monk and Fenelek were the same person. And I delivered the line just as the book said to deliver it. And it got all of them. And it was awesome. I've never had like such a perfect gotcha in a game before like that.
Well, that sounds like one they're going to be talking about for years to come. So, dude, you know, as your pal who's been in a lot of your games and as your pal who knows that you've always wanted to run this, I am truly happy that you finally got to run Horror on the Orient Express.
Thanks, man.
All right, and here we are again with another Indie RPG elevator pitch brought to you by our friends over at Exalta Funeral. Today, our guest is Tony Vasinda. You also may know him as Tony Plus One from the Plus One Experience gaming show. He has recently launched Funeral Fridays over on his channel on Twitch, which highlights new and exciting things coming out from Exalta Funeral. And Tony has a brand new Kickstarter he's going to tell you about right now. So without further ado, Tony, how's it going?
I'm doing great. How are y'all doing?
Doing good, man. Doing good. So why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about your current Kickstarter, Down We Go?
Yeah, so Down We Go is a rules light OSR style RPG by Marcus Lindrum. He's a Swedish designer. This is his second RPG that he's released. I saw it online about 9 months ago. He put up this absolutely beautiful 1 A5 page set of rules in the Minimalist RPG group over on Facebook. And I was like, I love the look of this. I love the way it seems. I love what you've done with the role system here and kind of condensing skill and class and a bunch of other things down into these 4 simple archetypes. I would love to play this on stream. Marcus came on stream and played it with a bunch of the people from the West Coast OSR scene. And we just started working on it together, developing it. Marcus put out a couple of one-page dungeons, and then we've just built a team of that, of people and designers from all over the globe who have each contributed small parts to build up the city of Infinitopolis, the core setting, which is this sprawling anti-canon setting that sits in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by ruins and dungeons, and creates a perfect atmosphere to just get down to dungeon diving, along with urban city crawls, rooftop point crawls, and a bunch of other things that we have planned as part of the release.
And that's very cool. And one of the things that really struck me about this game is that a lot of it comes in a very Mad Lib style package where it's up to the people who are involved to describe things and to give keywords that are going to really unlock and further develop the adventure.
Yeah, so we kind of started into the process, and Marcus had already integrated for each of the dungeons 4 different adjectives, these 4 different keywords in this kind of Mad Lib style fill in the blank process for where the monsters and traps and other things were that were each inspired by that keyword. So if you're in the Watcher's Tower, that's very different than being in the Alchemist Tower, and they both have the same floor plan, but they both have very different contents inside of them, monsters inside of them. You're going to encounter different things in different spaces. But then when we were doing our play testing, I noticed that Marcus kept on asking all of the players for different rumors that they had heard, you know, as they were going through, and before they went down. You know, you've heard a rumor about this person who went down in this dungeon in this area a long time ago. You know, tell me what that rumor was. And it's where we built the lore as loot system. It was just something Marcus was doing, but it actually just hooked the players in so well to do a little bit more team brewing rather than just the GM home brewing everything, and created a really solid feel because they would encounter things down in the depths that were connected to the rumors that they had made. It also took a lot more of the prep off of the GM. The GM and the players in Down We Go can spend about the same amount of time prepping before they head down in for an adventure. And I love being able to take a lot of that work off their shoulders.
I just love it when one simple thing makes my brain light up. The preconceived notion about Rumors Table is that that's GM side, because like that's narrative. It's like you built the dungeon, so you know, give little tidbits at to give that part to the players is just like, that's so clever. And I never would have thought about it in a million years.
Yeah, it was just in the middle of like our public playtest stream that we did for 5 weeks in June. Marcus did it like 3 sessions in a row, and I was like, hey, Marcus, is that a thing you want? Like, should we be doing that in the game? Do we need to write that down? And he was like, what do you mean? I was like, you're doing this thing where you're asking for these rumors and these lore, and you're letting players answer them. And it's amazing, and we're all loving it. So let's put a couple sentences in that make that how we do the game. It's been an absolute blast to do the dev side because Marcus has done so many simple elegant things in the game that I feel like lots of times he isn't even aware of. And each of the contributors has taken some of that and built onto it and added other pieces out. The factions, additional rumor tables, businesses, events, other things like that typically would have been all GM facing choices can be rolled randomly, but then each of them has some key pieces that players get to speak into also. And again, it is like this absolute flip of things, but that makes it a much more equitable table and makes it so much easier to run because you can be surprised as the GM in the same way that a player can. And I love that experience.
And that's a very unique experience. As people who've run games in many different systems over many years, there's a certain adversarial nature to being a game master. There's also nothing new under the sun to a degree because you're the one controlling everything. And yeah, the surprise does come to a point from the players when they do something that you're not expecting them to, but to have them involved in the actual world building and scene building of what's happening, that's amazing.
Yeah. One of my other favorite things is even if you have new players come out as characters die because characters die in the system, the entire setting is fairly anti-canon. So even if you're going back down into the same dungeon, or even if you heard a rumor one time, when you leave the city and come back to it, the streets and the areas shift and change actively within the game. And so if you have a different answer later on in the game, it's not that the previous answer was wrong and this one is now right. It's that it's a different time in a different space, and now the answer is different. So that process continues to build and grow, and those old rumors matter, but the new ones that are emerging start to impact them and change. I love the openness of that and how constantly we all got to be thrilled by what emerged in the narrative we were creating around just the simple act of dungeon crawling.
And that really does speak also to the idea of the urban legend as well, right? You know, no matter where you are, and I know it's a broad generalization to a degree, but no matter where you are in any country, there's always that story that you grow up knowing as a kid that wasn't from when you were a kid. It was from the generation before you, maybe the generation before that. And it's a story that through the retelling changes and morphs into something else. And I think that really is an important way to see and understand a story, because being that it's non-canon, you're not beholden to decades worth of lore and anything else that might anchor a story into place. You're free because the story changes as you change throughout the time you're playing.
Yeah, I love it.
So one thing about Down We Go that I noticed is that you're launching on Gamefound and not Kickstarter. Can you run our listeners through that a little bit?
Yeah, so Gamefound is a pledge manager for a long time. They've been around helping people get their orders to their backers for a long time. Last year, they launched a closed beta for crowdfunding on their site because they just figured they might as well give it a try for their own projects because they're connected to Awakened Realms. They've had mostly board games. We're only the second RPG going up on it, but it's a crowdfunding platform that is specifically created for tabletop game content. And talking to Ryan over at Gamefound, he's really hoping it can be a place where indie RPG creators can find a really great home. There's a lot of quality of life things, a lot of great communication tools baked into it. And as soon as the campaign is done, you can roll it right over to being your pledge manager rather than having to find another one. So we're really excited about being one of the first couple of RPGs on there, but it is also a little bit intimidating because it doesn't have that footprint. So we would really love anybody's support in just helping get the word out. Even if you can't back that, we'd love to have your support there also.
Dear listener, when you hear this episode, Down We Go will be on Gamefound, and it's going to be on Gamefound to the 24th of September. I highly, highly, highly recommend you check this out. It's a really cool way to dive into a dungeon. And it's something that I've not experienced before myself, and I can't wait to get to the table. So, Tony, before we let you go, you also run a Twitch channel where you recently started doing Funeral Fridays, where you're talking about things that are happening and things that are new and exciting in the world of Exalted Funerals. Why don't you tell our listeners about that as well and give a little plug to your channel?
Yeah, so if you want to check us out at twitch.tv/Tony+1 or at youtube.com/+1exp, we basically cover a wide range of indie RPGs. A little while ago, Exalted Funeral, who we've done a few videos for like the ARC campaign and other things like that, said, hey, we really love working with you. We'd love to talk about doing something that helps feature the ongoing content. So last Friday, the last Friday of the month at the time we recorded this, we had our first funeral party, which is a monthly web show where I sit down with Jarrett Crater, who is the project manager over at Exalted Funeral, and usually a couple of guests, and we go through a few different segments. What's in the hearse, basically what's coming to it, the obituaries, what are things that have recently gone off of the Exalted Funeral site, embalming for fun and profit, which is basically how the sausage is made, tips and tools on how to make your own RPGs if you're into the design scene. And then the eulogy is where we sit down with the creators somewhere in the Exalted Funeral catalog and talk to them about what inspires them, what they hope people will say at their funeral when we're standing over their body, and a bunch of other stuff. We had almost 100 people showed up. I think it was a little over 100 throughout the course of the entire broadcast. And it was just an absolute blast to spend time with the rest of the Exalted Funeral community. And we'll be doing that again the final Friday of this month. Also, so come on over. We always have a giveaway. We'll always have a guest. It was our first one, so we're just figuring it all out. But it was an absolute blast, and we can't wait to do more.
All right, dear listener, definitely get on that as well, because listen, if you want to know how the sausage is made and you want to see where your money is spent, definitely check out Funeral Fridays over on Tony's channel. Tony, where can our listeners find you on the intranet?
You can find me at Plus One Exp across any social media platform. If you want to email me, you can be at tony@plusoneexp.com. You can find everything that we do at plusoneexp.com.
Well, folks, this was another amazing episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Tony, thanks for coming on the show tonight. I definitely recommend you check out Down We Go over on Gamefound, running through the 24th of September. Stu, where can the people find you?
They can find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG, posting about vintage RPGs right there in the name.
There you go. A little on the nose, but I love it. You could find me on Instagram and on Twitter at John McGuire RPG. I am doing stuff online more because I have a game to promote. Speaking of Exalted Funeral, you can pick up Rocket to Russia right now over at Exalted Funeral. If you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Your reviews really do help other listeners to find us. If you really like the show, really like, maybe want to go to prom with the show, think about becoming a patron, patreon.com/vintagerpg. We have got a behind-the-scenes look at Stu's book, still tentatively titled Experience Points. We've got a behind-the-scenes look at my book, Rocket to Russia, the first adventure for 3-2-1 action as well. We have early release episodes. We've got some videos. We've got some cool stuff that we've been talking about, not being able to talk about. We're going to be able to talk about that soon coming up, as well as a killer Discord community that we'd love for you to be a part of. Patreon.com/vintagerpg. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dego West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.